Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today is a very overdue reading wrap up. I have somehow let too many months go by without actually finally wrapping up all the books I've been able to read. So with that in mind, I have a rather massive one to go through today. I have 17 books I think I owe y'all mini reviews on. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in because this might be a long one. The first two books I have to show off are a part of the same series, and that is Network Effect and Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. This is books 5 and 6 within the Murderbot Diary series. Currently one of my favorite sci-fi series to date. It's just the perfect combination of delightful characters and intriguing plotline. If you're not familiar, the Murderbot Diary centers our main character Murderbot, and at the beginning of book 1, we're introduced to Murderbot as it basically discovered how to hack its own mainframe, giving it full control over its own psyche and decisions it wants to make throughout its day. However, though, it still sort of has to play off that it's performing its day job, which is to be a murderbot, protect humans on faraway planets in the interest of this very powerful company. But in reality, all Murderbot really wants to do is watch its favorite shows and contemplate its existence, and honestly kind of like be removed from society and be a little bit depressed. Murderbot in general is very much a vibe. Over the course of this series, you watch Murderbot sort of begrudgingly make friends, go on a journey of self-discovery, really try to figure out what it wants for itself. And every book builds on these themes and concepts, but also acts as a sort of adventure of the week situation. So every book kind of has its own plot line, but everything still like feeds into each other. Fugitive Telemetry is kind of like a murder mystery-esque story with Murderbot as the primary detective. And Network Effect is the first full-length novel I've had the opportunity to read within this series. And this I really enjoyed, and I would say it's probably my favorite of the series so far. In it, we not only are going on a new adventure, meeting up with some characters that we're familiar with, but I think because of its longer length, I really enjoyed getting to experience kind of multiple plot movements and more time seeing Murderbot like contemplate different things and interact with specific characters. I just really liked reading a full-length novel featuring Murderbot, one of my favorite characters of all time. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to get more full-length novels, but just in general, I love this series so much, and I would probably give both of these books 5 stars. From there, I read the worst book I've read in recent memory, and that book is The Games Gods Play by Abigail Owens. I went into this book with like hopeful expectations, as I do with pretty much every romantasy read I decide to check out. This one did sound interesting to me as it does center Greek mythology. We follow our main character who spends her days trying to keep her head low and not gain any attention from the Greek gods. She also is part of this like thief guild and is, as you would assume, a thief. However, though, one day, unexpectedly, she catches the eye of Hades. They have this unexpected connection, and he chooses her to be his champion in this set of trials where all the gods compete against each other, and the winner becomes like the king of Olympus. And then from there, we not only have to witness this growing relationship between Hades and our main character, but also have to go through all these different trials and tribulations and watch our main character try to survive, make enemies, blah, 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 blah. Here's the thing. This book is really bad. And I feel like I'm usually someone who tries to focus on the positive, even reviewing books that I don't particularly like, but there's very little positive I can actually say about this story. This book really felt like a checklist that the author was just trying to get through. Like a setup for a hate to love relationship, check. Characters with a pet name for each other, check. A spunky main character who always has a comeback no matter the situation, check. It just was so grating to read, not only from a plotting point of view, like the pacing, not only within the relationship, but within the trials themselves were really unbalanced, but also like the dialogue was really distracting and just like not believable at all. I felt no stakes within the relationship. I felt no stakes within the friendship. The action and combat elements were both too fast and way too slow. Like pretty much everything about this book I did not enjoy, which was really disappointing because I actually went into this hoping that I would like it. So needless to say, I didn't like this. I'd probably give this book like 1 star, 1.5 stars. I know, a little brutal for me. The next book I have to show off was a very anticipated release, and that is The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is the third and final book to the Bloodsworn saga by John Gwynne, which is his Viking and Norse mythology inspired epic fantasy trilogy. This is a series that I would say overall I enjoyed. I really appreciate the sort of dark and desolate landscape that this book is placed in. It's giving grim, it's giving cold. All of our characters are very talented in the art art of war, let's say. It's set in a fantasy landscape where for a very long time there have been these communities of humans, and they have sort of been rebuilding after a massive fight with the gods that happened in this land many generations earlier. But now with the death of the gods, human power and might is beginning to rise, and a few specific humans are trying to gather all the power for themselves. At the beginning of book one, we set out on various adventures following people in warrior bands seeking glory, a mother seeking revenge and trying to find her lost child, and a whole slew of characters in between all of these things. We also begin to see hints of the gods rising once again. A great combination of magic, combat, politics. The landscape that the book takes in is very much a vibe, and overall I did appreciate the characters. It's definitely a book that has a lot of plot and moves very quickly, and the combat specifically is very well written. I feel like that is where John Gwyn's talent shines. As a third installment and the final book in a trilogy, I found it to be pretty good. It's definitely my least favorite of the trilogy so far, and I did find some aspects of the middle to drag for me a little bit, but there were definitely some very satisfying moments. Still, the signature action that I would expect from John Gwyn, and for the most part, a pretty satisfying conclusion that would make me, like, in general, happy with this series overall. But I'd probably give this final book like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. It was solidly good. The first two books, though, I did feel were better, and those were, like, great. The next book I checked out was A Dark and Drowning Tide by Alison Saft. This is a sapphic fae, academic rivals to lovers, murder mystery-esque story. It's definitely a book that has a lot of plot inputs. Like, there were a lot of ideas sort of brought together within this story, and for the most part, I would say it was successful. In my opinion, this is a book that's not going to necessarily blow your mind, but it does have two very likable main characters, lots of yearning, drama, and angst sort of center stage, and generally speaking, a pretty entertaining plotline. It's not a book I really see myself rereading or picking back up again, but I don't regret reading it, if that makes sense. But this is a story that follows our two main characters, two women who are studying under the same mentor. At the beginning of this book, they're about to venture out into the landscape to try to find this like lost fairy pool that will grant people like immense power if they find it. However, though, at the beginning of the story, their mentor tragically passes away, and now these two characters sort of are working alongside each other to try to solve this mystery, also carry on this mission. They're surrounded by all different types of people. Again, there are a lot of different plot inputs, but I will say the strength is definitely the two main characters and their romance. It was entertaining, and I would give it like a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I checked out was another final book in a trilogy. I was really trying to wrap some things up recently, and that was Ancillary Mercy by Ann Leckie. I love Ann Leckie so much, and this is definitely a sci-fi trilogy I enjoyed immensely from beginning to end. This is a space opera series who introduces us to our main character, Breck, and before the start of this novel, Breck was once known as the Justice of Torin. She existed as multiple entities all together, not only as a ship AI responsible for the lives of like so many humans that live aboard her, but also she lived through the existence of 10 ancillaries. And again, she existed in this experience of collective consciousness. However, though, at the beginning of book one, we find Breck as a singular individual in a desolate, snowy landscape as she is seeking out revenge. And in book one, we not only begin to understand Breck as an individual, but also began to understand Breck when they were the Justice of Torin and how they ended up where they are today. This, I feel like, is another really great example of like really endearing and lovable characters that became more and more and more center stage as you move throughout the trilogy, while still having an intriguing sci-fi plot. I would say book one of this trilogy was very action-packed, very conspiracy forward. You still love Breck and a lot of the side characters, but there was a lot of like sci-fi conspiracy to hold you over. With every book, though, there's still sci-fi conspiracy and lots of problems that Breck has to solve, but the characters of the story become more and more center stage, so much so that like the scope of the series becomes smaller and smaller with every installment, which is rare, especially within like a sci-fi space opera series, but I would say I do feel like it worked. It kind of became like very sort of cozy at the end. There was lots of tea, there was lots of discussion of feeling, and characters finding like friendship or camaraderie for the first time. We also focused much more in on like one singular planet, and the politics were still significant, and everything was still like informing each other, but the overall scope of the story did become much smaller. And I can see how this could possibly be a little contentious depending on your preferences for sci-fi series. For me, I liked it because I loved Breck and I loved the side characters and I loved how endeared to everyone I became over the course of this trilogy. And honestly, Anne Leckie's writing is just so good. So overall, I would say I really enjoyed this trilogy. I would give the third and final book a 4 out of 5 stars, but definitely a trilogy I would recommend checking out, especially if you love character forward stories. The next book I have to talk about is a big one, and that is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I have an entire reading vlog documenting the reading process of this massive 5th installment within the Stormlight Archive. So if you're wanting to watch like my real-time reactions with obviously non-spoiler opinions, but if you're not familiar, Wind and Truth is the 5th book within the Stormlight Archive and also the final book of the first arc of this epic fantasy series that's going to be made up of 10 books eventually. The Stormlight Archive is obviously a little bit hard to summarize given that every book is literally massive, but it's basically set in this fantasy landscape where there's been this war of revenge occurring between two groups of people now for about a generation. One group of people are known as the Athleki, and they've basically moved their entire like society and cultural footprint from their original capital to this war front, as like war is very central within their culture. Through this series, we're first introduced to a huge cast of characters, but some of the main ones are Kaladin, who is a doctor turned soldier turned slave. We follow Dalinar, who is a general of the army who begins to get visions. We follow a young woman named Shallan, who is a academic who's trying to like steal from her advisor. Follow an assassin who weeps as he kills. Like there are so many characters that you will learn about and become intrigued by. This series also has so much action, so much magic in many different forms, from like combat magic to like artifact magic, which I thought was quite cool. The plot progression of this whole series, again, like so much happens, and I would say overall I do feel like it really built on itself quite well. As a mid-series finale novel, overall I would say Brandon Sanderson was pretty effective in his writing of this story. I really enjoyed like the large sweeping plot movements that he included within this. I liked the different journeys and quests that we went on with those characters. And I would say like the ultimate moment near the end of this book was like quite shocking to me, and I appreciated the sort of broader scope that he introduced to us as we sort of wrapped up this 5th installment. I would say this book isn't perfect. I feel like it's definitely for the fans. There was some unsubtle character writing that sometimes felt like a little over the top, especially for characters that we know and love so much. Like it felt a little preachy on behalf of some of these characters, and I almost feel like they lost some of their like inherent nature. That being said though, still loved them, still happy to follow them, and I would say overall this was quite an epic read. I'd probably give this book like a 4.25 out of 5 stars. The next book I was able to complete was Weyward by Amelia Hard. I was really looking forward to picking this book up. It has stellar reviews online, and the inputs of the story I would say are generally things that really appealed to me, but I will say overall I left the reading experience of this rather disappointed. This is a story that centers 3 women a part of the same family through time. It also centers witchcraft and also trauma through time. Throughout the reading experience of this book, we have 3 distinct perspectives. First is Kate, who is our modern day perspective, and we find her at the beginning of the story fleeing London from an abusive relationship and settling into a cottage in the countryside that she inherited from a great aunt. Also follow Altha in the 1600s, and she's currently on trial for witchcraft. And then lastly, Violet, who is a woman living during World War II, and we see her struggle with the desire to want to pursue an education and independence for herself, but instead being sort of straitjacketed by societal expectations. This book is a lot, I will say that. It definitely centers a lot of different traumatic aspects of the story, and there's a lot of trauma that these women experience in all of their different time periods, and those things are also sort of connected through time. I appreciated the sort of multi-POV aspect of this, liked that we had an expanded timeline, and I also liked the magic that sort of connected these women too. That being said though, I never felt any of the characters wholly realized, and it almost felt like the largest part of their characterization was the trauma that they had to experience on the behalf of others, and I would have just appreciated a little bit more in terms of building these women up to feel fully realized for me personally while reading it. I thought the writing style was pretty, but I found just sort of the execution to be a little bit lacking for me. So with that in mind, I gave this book like a 2.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I picked up was The Lost Story by Meg Schaefer. I was unsure what I was going to feel about this book because I did read The Wishing Game by this author, which is another very popular release, and I was personally let down by it, but I would say overall I did enjoy this story. This is is a book that is inspired by fairy tales that a lot of us have read growing up, from the Chronicles of Narnia to Peter Pan. But this story introduces us to two main characters, two men who, when they were teenagers, actually got lost in the woods together, and they disappeared for 6 months. No one knew what happened, and then miraculously one day they reappeared once again, but with no memory of what occurred to them. Since this fateful moment, these two teenagers, now men, have not really spoken to each other since. One of them now, though, is like a famed person for finding like missing people, and at the beginning of the story he's approached by another woman whose sister has gone missing, apparently in the very same area that he went missing all those years ago. And so begins a story of reconnection, romance, fantasy. This is a portal fantasy story, and I would say it was quite imaginative. I felt like the author did a good job combining like elements of contemporary fiction and the fantastical to create a rather emotional and interesting story, but she also relied on a lot of pulling directly from a lot of reference points that readers would have, so she didn't have to spend a lot of time on world building because it sort of just like slotted in naturally within the story, which I found to be impressive. I really loved the reconnection that we got to experience for our two main characters and the sort of rebutting of the emotions that existed between them. I loved learning about their past. I really loved this sort of fantastical place, so much so that I almost wish we got more of it. Overall, I would say this book was like a solid read, one I definitely would recommend. I'm not sure if I would reread it personally, but I found the writing styles, the concepts, and the execution to be like overall solidly good, and I would give this book like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. The next book I decided to check out was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This, of course, is the sequel to The Divine Rivals, which I read a few years ago and really enjoyed. Rebecca Ross has quickly become like one of my favorite fantasy writers because I feel like for me, she really has the perfect balance of fantasy world building and romance, and her romantic pacing is also superb. She always has so much yearning between her characters, and I also just really appreciate her originality when it comes to crafting her fantasy landscapes, and how her romances and her fantasy worlds interact are just like so good. I've always been highly entertained by anything that she has put out, but this series is set in a fantasy world that's very interesting. It sort of reads like a historical fiction setting, sort of like a World War I-esque vibe, but it clearly has a fantastical influence because magic here exists. And in fact, there's actually also been a great war that has been happening now for a very long time between two gods. And magic sort of exists in an everyday way, but particularly more so in like magical objects and in the existence of these like massive supernatural figures that are influencing like the everyday lives of humans. Our main characters, Iris and Roman, are both writers at the same newspaper, and at the beginning of book 1 are competing against each other for the editor position, and they very much do not like each other at all. But unbeknownst to both of them, they've also been secretly writing to each other at night with their magical typewriters, and it's just an absolute delight to read. This book also centers like wartime correspondence as both of these figures become more involved in the war effort and travel to the war front, and book 2 sort of expands on all of the dramatic events and happenings that happened in book 1. Something I really appreciated about book 2 is that I really feel like it still kept the core and spirit of the story, meaning that there was still a lot of letter writing at play within this narrative. I wasn't sure how the author was going to progress the plot, but I feel like she did such a great job like keeping to the spirit of the book while presenting so many new and like anxiety-ridden plot elements that will just keep you on the edge of your seat, and still having two characters with so much love and yearning at the core of it. Like, I gobbled this book up. It was so heart-wrenching but delightful, and just like a great combination of fantasy and romance. I would give this like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I was able to complete was Northwoods by Daniel Mason. This is a book that Clay and I actually read together for our loose book club that we have going, and overall we actually gave this book the same score, and it was really fun to read and discuss it with him. But Northwoods basically centers a writing mechanic and concept that both Clay and I really enjoy. Basically, it centers one house and one farm through a very large expanse of time. Basically, we watch the evolution of this like one small cabin as it transforms into an apple orchard, to a home, to many different people throughout time, starting in like the 1600s all the way to present day. And we see how all of these people are sort of connected through time, and how all their individual stories sort of unfurl in this house, but also how the legacy of this house impacts their individual stories, and also how like everyone's lives are influenced by the time period that they're existing in, but also how things kind of like persist through time, like no matter how much time has passed. Structurally speaking, every single chapter of this book is from a new perspective and point of view, which I personally love. I love a huge cast of characters within books, and I feel like this was very effective, especially in the writing style of making this decision. Some chapters are really long, very shocking, very interesting. Other chapters are very short, but still sort of add to the overall ambiance and picture of what's happening. Something else I really appreciated about this story is that, like, individually as you're going along, you're following all these different perspectives and chapters and lives as you're reading them, but you're not quite sure how everything sort of plugs into each other. But slowly, as you begin to see that sort of tapestry of experience form, it's quite satisfying. I would say this was very good. It wasn't like a masterpiece. It wasn't a 5 out of 5 star read for either Clay and I, but we both really enjoyed the writing style. We really appreciated a lot of the imagery, particularly around like apple orchards and trees, and a lot of the themes that were present throughout time. And overall, we really enjoyed this read and liked the ending quite a bit. So I think we both gave it about a 4 out of 5 star rating. The next book I picked up was The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leong. This is a newer cozy fantasy release that I've heard excellent things about, so I was very excited to pick it up. I was also craving a palate cleanser against some of the more intense books I've read to close out the year. But this is a story following our main character Tao, who is an immigrant storyteller that travels between different villages in this fantasy landscape, giving out small fortunes. She never wants to give out a fortune that's too significant because those feel very unsafe to her, but instead she focuses on small fortunes like who the barmaiden is going to kiss or where the lost sheep is from the herd, like things like this. Until one day she comes across a semi-reformed thief and an ex-mercenary who are traveling together to try to find one of these figures' lost daughters. She sees his fortune and they begin to travel together. They also add to their crew a baker who has a need for adventure. This is a story that's all about found family. Something I actually really appreciated about this and found refreshing is that it doesn't really center any romantic plot line. It's so much more about friendship, learning to trust, and like growing close to people in a platonic way, and seeing the different relationships begin to form and watching people become open with one another, begin to trust others around them, which is like a really satisfying thing to read. Specifically, Tao, her identity, her childhood, and a lot of the trauma she experienced growing up was also centered in this, and I really appreciated the exploration and the character arc we got to experience with that. Overall, this was a calming, very charming story that had the perfect mix of just enough plot that was very engaging, but as it is a cozy fantasy, nothing ever felt too scary about what was going on, and was just like a really heartwarming read overall, and I would give this a 3.75 out of 5 stars. Then I decided to check out a very popular read from many years ago that I have also read and really enjoyed at the time. I've been struggling with romantasy recently, so I decided to go back and see if popular romantasy reads from many years ago would still land for me, or maybe it's just an issue I have with the genre at large. The book I decided to pick up was Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder, and I'm happy to report, honestly, I felt like this book still very much landed. This is a story that follows our main character Yelena, and at the beginning of this book, she finds herself in prison, and she has been imprisoned within this castle for over a year after killing a son of a powerful figure within this land. However, though, at the beginning of the story, she's offered an opportunity at clemency if she becomes the poison tester for the ruler of this kingdom, meaning she has to taste all of his food, and if there's any type of fatal ingredient in there, she obviously would be the one to die first. From there, she begins her training under our other main character, who is the chief of security, and they begin to form a very complicated relationship. I really appreciated this book because I felt like it had a really nice balance of things. The core center of the story was Yelena sort of rediscovering herself, her own individual power, gaining strength and confidence in herself once again, beginning to process and overcome various traumas that occurred in different moments of her life, watching her make friends, take on enemies, these types of things. But yes, obviously there's also a very central romance within this, but in true classic fashion, at least for me, like this romance would probably not satisfy most romantasy readers because it's all about yearning. Like, it is all about two characters that clearly have feelings for each other, but don't really want to admit it to them, let alone themselves. Seeing that sort of play out on page is really entertaining, especially for me. I love the slow burn and the slow build of everything. I found it to be like really entertaining and really unputdownable. I like the writing style, I like the fantasy influence. I liked pretty much every aspect of this, and I think it's a solid romantasy read in my opinion, and I would give it like a 3.75, 4 stars out of of 5 stars. The next book I checked out was Borne by Jeff Vandermeer, and this was the weird little sci-fi book of my dreams. I love strange stories. I love picking up books where I really have no idea what in the heck is going on, but kind of being taken along for the ride and just trying to like piece things together as I go. And this is that in spades. I would say this is a story I would recommend picking up knowing as little as possible, because the sort of shocking nature of the landscape and sort of piecing things together as you go is such a large part of the plot experience of this story. But to keep it very high level, we follow our main character Rachel, who survives by scavenging in this very like desolate world and landscape. And one day she's scavenging on this massive flying bear, and there she finds an unexpected sentient thing, which she brings back to her home where she resides with her lover, and things get very complicated from there. This story is so introspective and so interesting and so emotional and imaginative, and the sci-fi world that the author was able to create absolutely hooked me and had me on the edge of my seat. It was just such an interesting, shocking, and no way could you anticipate like where this book was going vibe-wise, world-wise, plot-wise. It was just like a very satisfying experience, and I can't wait to read more books by Jeff Vandermeer this year, because I really like not only his writing styles, his worlds, but also the themes he really centered within this. Like, I'm so excited to read more books by this author. I'd give this book like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. From there, I also picked up A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie, which is the first book to the Age of Madness trilogy. This is a trilogy set within the larger Joe Abercrombie world and universe. It is technically like book 7 of this world, and it is definitely a situation where it's best to read all of the books within this world in order of release. But I'm also happy to report that this is probably the best book I've read so far in 2025. I know it's only January, but I am obsessed with book 1 of this trilogy. And I also feel like with every Joe Abercrombie book I read, every single book gets better and better and better. But this is a series set in Joe Abercrombie's grimdark fantasy world, and we are introduced to so many characters over the lifetime of this series. But what's important to know is that there's different empires that have been at each other's throats for various reasons for a very long time. And there's lots of powerful people across these empires that are influencing these conflicts for their own very selfish reasons, either monetarily or from a power standpoint, maybe both. And there's just lots of like corruption across the board through time. In the Age of Madness trilogy, we're following a whole new set of characters. We're entering a new age of this empire that we are familiar with, and it is the age of like technological advancement and industry, very industrial revolution core. And with the rise of some new people gaining a lot of money in these new industries, there's all new miseries that are being experienced by the everyday person. There's less work to go around. The work itself is brutal and dangerous and violent and unhealthy. Land is being taken. People are being forced to the city. There's no money. It's just unrest is on the rise, and that is very much center stage within this book. Within this trilogy, we're also introduced to so many characters, and I also feel like characters that are the most likable I've really read from Joe Abercrombie. They're all still incredibly flawed and very dark people, but I found myself very endeared to everyone almost right away, and their connections to other characters we're familiar with were also very, very satisfying. I just feel like the plot movements of this first book in this trilogy was so unputdownable, and the thing is, I was expecting really great characters, which Joe Abercrombie delivered on, but usually his plots take a little bit more time to develop. At least that was the case in his first trilogy. But I feel like he came out swinging in book 1 and basically had like 10 out of 10 in both categories of plot and character. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I want to read the next one right away. I loved this. And then the last book I was able to complete recently was The Book That Broke the World by Mark Lawrence. I have lost the dust jacket somewhere, so please forgive me. This, of course, is book 2, the first one being The Book That Wouldn't Burn. I loved The Book That Wouldn't Burn. It was one of my favorite books when I read it a couple of years ago, but for some reason I have been putting off book 2 now for quite a long time, and I'm so happy to report that book 2 was amazing. I think the reason I was putting off book 2 is that The Book That Burned the World was such an enjoyable reading experience because of the ambiance and mystery that Mark Lawrence was able to inject within the story the entire way. But at the end of book 1, in a very satisfying manner, there was a huge reveal. And I thought with this reveal, structurally and stylistically, that the story was going to have to change moving forward. But fear not, the vibes, mystery, and atmosphere continued in book 2, and if anything, got more convoluted in a way that I just adored immensely. But if you're not familiar, this series basically centers this massive, unknowable library. Like, the scope and expansiveness of this place is truly unknowable. It has persisted and existed for an unknown amount of time. It has seen the rise and fall of various civilizations run by various individuals and entities, but it has continued to persist. And that is sort of the main setting of this series. In book 1, we're introduced to our two primary main characters. First is a girl from an area called the Dust, which is a settlement outside of a major city where the library exists. Her settlement is attacked, forcing her to flee to the city, where she becomes an apprentice to the library, like trained in its ways. We also follow a boy who has lived inside of a chamber of this library his entire life with his siblings. Their paths and fates become intertwined in an unexpected fashion. And here we are in book 1, but we're shifting into book 2, and after the explosive end of book 1, book 2 was like even more explosive. It had such a great reading vibe to it. I love the feeling of being strung along. I love understanding what's happening in front of me, but not being able to grasp the larger picture of all these different threads throughout the story until the whole thing comes together. And that is exactly what Mark Lawrence did with book 2. We got even more perspectives from book 1, so we got to approach the angle of the story from more directions. It's kind of hard to talk about, I'm not gonna lie, because I don't want to spoil the mystery or the vibes for anyone who's looking to pick up this book, because like any hint, I feel like sort of takes things away. So just know that book 1 was amazing, but so was book 2. And he was able to continue with creating such an interesting world and ambiance that's dark and twisty, and the centering of such like heart-wrenching themes and like trauma through time and like the persistence of violence and the folly of man. Like, all of these things are very much center stage. I love book 2. I maybe even loved it more than book 1, which I was not expecting at all, but I will say 5 out of 5 stars. Alrighty guys, that is my massive reading wrap up. Thank you so much for your patience if you made it to the end of this video, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.